Okay, so, this document on emotional abandonment that you sent over,
Right.
I gotta say, it really got me thinking.
Yeah.
We all want to feel heard and supported in our relationships, right?
Ooh.
But this document, it, really digs deep into what happens when that support just isn't there.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not always as obvious as you think. We
Mhm.
think of, the big blowouts and dramatic exits.
Yeah.
But what really struck me was how this document, it highlights those smaller, quieter moments
Mm-hmm.
where someone kind of pulls away emotionally. It leaves you feeling like you're on your own in the middle of something important.
Yeah. And that can be so much more damaging in the long run.
Exactly. And this document calls those moments microdanios, right?
Exactly. Microdanios. Small, but they add up over time.
Like death by 1,000 paper cuts.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
So it's like even if someone isn't intentionally trying to hurt you,
Right.
these little moments of disconnect, they can really do a number on a relationship.
Absolutely. And what's interesting? This document, it defines emotional abandonment as one person withdrawing emotionally during these emotionally charged moments. And that leaves the other person feeling unsupported, isolated, even ignored.
It's like they're right there physically,
Yeah.
but emotionally, they've checked out.
Exactly. It creates this imbalance in the relationship.
And that imbalance, it's not just limited to romantic relationships, right?
Not at all. This can happen in friendships, families, even at work.
It's that universal need to feel seen and heard.
Exactly. We all crave that validation.
And when it's not there, that's when things can start to unravel.
Exactly.
That's why I think this document is so important.
That's silhouette.
Because it doesn't just point out the problem,
Mm-hmm.
it gives us a framework for understanding it, really getting to the root of what's going on.
Yes.
And then it offers actual strategies for doing something about it.
Exactly. And that's what we really need, right? Tools and strategies.
Because knowledge without action, it doesn't really get us anywhere.
I completely agree.
So let's dive into some of those strategies, because this document is chock full of them.
Let's do it. I'm ready. So, one of the things this document really dives into is this idea of active listening.
Okay, active listening. I've heard that term before,
Right.
but honestly, I'm not always sure I'm doing it right.
Well, and that's the thing, right? It's one of those things that sounds simple enough in theory,
Yeah,
but in practice, it can be a lot more challenging than we realize.
for sure. So what does it actually look like then? How do we actually practice active listening?
So active listening, it's about being truly present in the conversation. It's not just about, hearing the words someone is saying.
Right.
It's about putting aside your own thoughts and judgments for a minute
Okay.
and really, really tuning into what the other person is trying to communicate. And I mean both verbally and non-verbally.
So it's like you're not just waiting for your turn to speak. You're not, planning your next brilliant point in your head. You're
Right.
really absorbing their words, their tone, even their body language.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you're asking clarifying questions to make sure you're understanding their perspective.
Okay, so it's not just about nodding along and say, every now and then.
No, not at all. It's about engaging with what they're saying, reflecting it back to them, making sure you're both on the same page.
Got it. So paraphrasing what they said.
Exactly. And here's a big one. Validating their emotions.
Validating emotions. Okay, that feels like a whole other can of worms. What if I don't agree with what they're feeling?
That's where things get really interesting and potentially tricky. Because validating someone's emotions, it doesn't mean you agree with their perspective.
Okay, that's helpful.
It's about acknowledging their experience.
Okay, so it's like saying, I see that you're hurting and that's valid, even if you don't necessarily understand why they're feeling that way.
Exactly. And think about it. Have you ever had someone dismiss your feelings? How did that make you feel?
Oh gosh, terrible. What's the point of even talking if you're just going to tell me I'm wrong for feeling the way I do?
Exactly. But when someone acknowledges your feelings, even if they don't fully understand them, it creates this sense of safety and connection.
That makes sense. It shows you're actually hearing them, seeing them.
Exactly. And that's huge. That lays the groundwork for a much more productive conversation.
So instead of saying, you shouldn't feel that way, it's more about saying something like, I hear you, I understand that you're feeling, and then you name the feeling, and that's valid.
Yes, exactly. And often, honestly, that's all it takes to de-escalate a situation and create space for real understanding.
Wow. So powerful.
It really is. Now, even with all the active listening and validation in the world, there are going to be times when emotions run high,
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And that's where another strategy from this document comes in. respecting emotional space.
Yes. This one really resonated with me. I used to think I always had to hash things out right then and there.
Right.
But this document, it suggests that sometimes stepping back can actually be the most loving thing we can do for ourselves and for the other person.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that sometimes we just need a little time and space to process our emotions before we can really engage in a productive conversation.
It's like, when you're working on a puzzle and you get stuck.
Yes.
Sometimes you just need to walk away for a bit,
Exactly.
come back to it with fresh eyes.
You got it. It's like hitting the pause button, not the stop button.
Right. You're not abandoning the conversation completely.
Exactly.
You're just giving yourself and the other person a chance to breathe.
And that requires trust. Right.
It does. Both people need to trust that the conversation will be revisited when they're both in a calmer headspace.
Precisely. And that requires clear communication, too.
Yeah, what does that look like?
It could be as simple as saying, hey, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed right now. I need a little time to process this before we continue talking. Can we circle back to this later tonight or tomorrow or whatever time frame feels right?
And when you do circle back around, that's important, right?
Absolutely. It's crucial.
It's, like you said, hitting pause, not stop.
Exactly. Because if you don't circle back, if that trust isn't there, if one person's worried that the conversation is just going to be swept under the rug, that's when things get messy.
Oh yeah, resentment builds.
Resentment, distrust, all that stuff.
It's like, okay, we're just going to ignore this giant elephant in the room.
Exactly. And that helps nobody.
So it's about finding that balance, right? Between honoring your own need for space,
Yes.
but also showing up for the other person and making sure they feel heard.
You got it. And that goes both ways.
Right.
Both people in the relationship need to feel comfortable doing that.
I think for me, I used to hesitate to ask for that space.
Really?
Yeah, because it felt like, I don't know, like I was admitting defeat or something. Like I wasn't strong enough to handle the conversation.
Oh, wow. I totally get that.
But framing it as respecting both of our needs, that changes things,
It does. It's a total perspective shift.
Because it's not about one person being right or wrong.
Right.
Or who's better at communicating or whatever. It's about creating a dynamic where both people feel safe, feel heard.
And ultimately, that's what builds stronger connections.
Right.
Like
You said earlier, connection, that's the foundation.
Yeah, and this document, it really drives that point home.
It does. And it reminds me of something else we talked about earlier. Those little moments of emotional disconnect, they can really add up over time.
The microdaños.
Yes, exactly. And this whole idea of respecting emotional space, it's like a way to prevent those microdaños from happening in the first place.
Right, because you're not just reacting in the heat of the moment. You're taking a step back, you're giving yourself time to cool down, and then you can come back to the conversation when you're both in a better headspace.
It's like choosing to respond thoughtfully instead of just reacting.
Exactly.
This has been eye-opening, I gotta say.
I know, right?
I feel like I have so much to think about now, in a good way.
Me too. It's like this document, it's given us a whole new lens to look at our relationships through.
It's like a toolkit for building more meaningful connections.
And isn't that what it's all about at the end of the day?
I think so. To feel seen, heard, understood, supported.
Absolutely.
And to be able to show up that way for the people in our lives, too.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, to our amazing listeners out there, thank you so much for diving deep with us today. We hope you found this conversation as insightful as we did. Until next time.
Take care.